It's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Jonathan Moreno, who is the David and Lynn Silfen University Professor of Medical Ethics and the History and Sociology of Science. He was also appointed in 2006. He came to Penn from the University of Virginia. He holds his bachelor's degree from Hofstra and his PhD from Washington University. And he is an expert in biomedical ethics. He is trained as a philosopher and is a philosopher in the deepest and the oldest sense. He's someone who's always searching for rigorous moral and ethical responses to urgent public issues of the day. And we are certainly confronted today, more than ever, with critical, moral, ethical questions about the delivery of healthcare, about the introduction of new technologies, about advances in genomics and genetics. And he is trained as a medical ethicist, but he focuses his work on imminent issues of the day. He founded Science Progress, which is a blog, a website, and a semi-annual magazine, which, quote, proceeds from the propositions that scientific inquiry is a critical engine of economic growth and must be dedicated to the common good. Scientific inquiry entails global responsibilities. It should lead to a more equitable, safer, and healthier future for all mankind. And I think those sentiments express very well our vision at Penn for knowledge in the service of society. He is an accomplished author, has published a number of books, and he will speak with us today about a very timely topic, brain research and national intelligence. It's my delight to introduce to you Jonathan Moreno.
Thanks, Vince. This is the second time I've had the pleasure of doing one of these events. I was also with Professor Jackson in New York, and I have to say it's no easier following him this time than it was last time. Thanks a lot. There's a cliche about the young philosophy professor, that was me 30 years ago, who writes his or her notes for his freshman lecture on the Republic and figures that's the last time he's going to have to write notes on Plato's Republic, you know. Doesn't change that much. But I'm now in a field in which it's like drinking from the fire hose, as they're saying in Washington these days. This last week, for this topic, I've been trying to sort out what slides I could make to keep up with the fact that for example, a couple of days ago, those Justice Department memos on interrogation in Guantanamo were released. That's a key element of what I want to talk to you about this morning. Much of this is actually drawn on a book that is now, unfortunately, rapidly becoming obsolete. It's time for the next edition, called Mind Wars, with this subtitle. And I think people don't always get exactly what I'm talking about when I tell them the idea of this is what's the relationship between neuroscience and national intelligence, but I think we're understanding now the importance of this. I have to say that this, and I hope I'll give you this sense by the end of the talk, this situation that we're facing now with respect to what happened with the detainees in the war on terror was entirely predictable because we have a history of having debates about what to do about this. For example, the pundits now are saying, well, and we actually heard this from the former Attorney General yesterday at a Wall Street Journal op-ed, that these revelations this week are going to make it more difficult to prosecute the war on terror. These are the same assertions that were made, and I believe that Vice President Cheney and others believe very firmly that were made following the revelations of the LSD experiments in the 1970s. Some of us are old enough to remember the Rockefeller Commission and the Church Commission. I'm going to be alluding to that throughout my talk. So, maybe Hegel was right. There are some cycles, and we're going through a very similar period now that we went through in the mid-1970s. If Senator Leahy goes ahead with his intent to have the Judiciary Committee do an investigation of the treatment of the detainees, part of that, I'm sure, is also going to be medical ethics questions about the role of psychologists, psychiatrists, and other healthcare professionals. I wrote an op-ed in 2002 in which I I said that it's very likely that there are certain kinds of formal or informal experiments and interrogation going on, and that indeed is one of the allegations that the Red Cross made in its recently released 2007 report to the CIA. So we are in the thick of something that's very relevant to what I'll be talking to you about for the next few minutes. But to do the history, since I'm also a professor of history and sociology of science at Penn, this is an image that will be familiar perhaps to many of you, although my freshmen don't recognize it, I have to say. This is an image from The Manchurian Candidate, the film. This is Frank Sinatra being brainwashed on the left, which I like to say is sort of appropriate since he was brainwashed and think that he could sing. It's a hostile crowd for a nice Saturday morning. So popular culture, as John Jackson can tell you better than I can, sort of lags behind political events. The idea of brainwashing, of course, came out of North Korea, the Korean War era, and the puzzling thing was how it was possible for the North Koreans and the communist Chinese to get our people to sign these false confessions in such great numbers as when they were prisoners of war. Now, when they came back, they were debriefed to find out, in part, what happened to them when they were in these prisoner of war camps during the Korean War. And an Army social scientist in the late 50s compiled a list of categories of the kinds of things that were done to them: sleep deprivation, degradation, humiliation, and so forth. So this list of categories of interrogation techniques that came out of our debriefing of our people when they came back from the Korean War as prisoners of war was released by Senator Carl Levin last year. And it turns out that this diagram, this chart, was used to train the SEER interrogators, the interrogators who worked in Guantanamo. So the historical irony is obviously not lost on us, and again is part of the current controversy. Now, I just want to point out that if you know the history, you actually get a leg up on seeing how this is unfolding. So part of the history here is the role of the Academy in sort of the era of pre-modern neuroscience. And there's been a great interest for a long time in the national security world, since at least the First World War, really, in how psychology could help the interests of national security. So the first IQ tests, I don't have a slide for this, but the first IQ test came out of the First World War. During the Second World War, Henry Murray, considered to be the father of personality theory, developed the thematic apperception test on Army contracts, and he was also, as it happens, the first chief psychologist for the CIA's predecessor, as many of you know, the OSS, and his great work, his master work, was Assessment of Men, which was published after the war in 1948, which was kind of the report of the work that he did during World War II for the Army. Alan Dulles, who was the first CIA director, was very concerned about these brainwashing claims. He went to Cornell to recruit two neurologists, Wolf and Hinkle. Wolf later became the president of the American Neurological Association, to do their own report on what happened to our people in North Korea. And Dulles was very interested in how the new hallucinogens with which people were not familiar, LSD in particular, mescaline derivatives, might be used in the Cold War. For example, what would happen if one of our atomic scientists was at a meeting in Paris and was kidnapped? Could a discreet man, in the language of the 1950s, could a discreet man be made indiscreet if he was given LSD? How would you protect us? How would you protect our people from that kind of truth serum, if it's possible for that to work? The person who did this for him was Sidney Gottlieb. He was sort of the Q that we see in the James Bond films. I hope that Q comes back in the next James Bond film. Is my favorite character. But he tended to work more in the chem-bio area than in giving Q a fancy BMW, giving Bond a fancy BMW. For example, he tried to develop poisons, a poison cigar to get to Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro has outlived everybody who's tried to kill him, although we may be getting to the end of the road even there. He also was involved in funding the early experiments on hallucinogens, projects called Artichoke and Bluebird, and the most famous one, perhaps, Project MK-Ultra. When Senator Frank Church in the 70s went back to try to reconstruct what was done by the agency in the 50s, they found that there was very little material left. Most of it had been destroyed, sanitized, if you will. But there was one set of documents that apparently the agency forgot to destroy, and they were the documents that were in the accounting department. So, we've all worked in bureaucracies, so you've got to have a memo that funds a project. And this is one of the funding memos for MK-Ultra, and it says how much of your tax dollars or your parents or grandparents or great-grandparents, perhaps at this point, were being used to fund the MK-Ultra program in 1953. So there were at least a couple of deaths associated with this activity. Frank Olson, this is now a sort of part of our urban legends, as it were. Frank Olson was the CIA's anthrax expert, was given LSD in 1953. I say here carefully, he descended to his death from the hotel across from Penn Station in late 1953. Very complicated story. Nobody's exactly sure what happened to Frank Olson. Harold Blauer was a lesser-known case. He was a New York City tennis pro. He was 42 years old. He was admitted to the Psychiatric Institute for clinical depression. He had separated from his wife and children. He was part of an unconsented mescaline experiment. In January of 53, he died of an overdose of something. My doctor friends tell me that you can't die from an overdose of mescaline, so there was something else going on in that compound that they gave him, perhaps. This was covered up until the late 1970s when his adult children were compensated by the federal government. Just to give you, again, the proximity of academia to this work, we should not be anachronistic about this. These are people who worked during the war. Some of them were in uniform. They continued these relationships after the war. One of my heroes, Henry Beecher, a great hero of human research ethics, was the first chaired professor of anesthesiology in the country. He was at Mass General and Harvard. His work on LSD was CIA supported. In the late 40s and early 50s, when Dr. Beecher went to Europe, he would identify individuals who were familiar with the effects of hallucinogens, give their names to the CIA as possible consultants in Europe, and this was just part of the culture. This was not a CIA or LSD experiment, but I thought it was sort of interesting while we're pounding on Harvard this morning. How many of you know that the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, who was a Harvard undergraduate in the late 50s, was in a psychological experiment, and it was a humiliation experiment. I can tell you the details, but in essence, he was part of this experiment. He wrote about it in his manifesto. He remembered it as a very unpleasant experience. I'm not asserting that Harvard created the Unabomber, although I do know people who've been made psychotic there, but in various ways. But of course, we don't do that at Penn. This really struck me, though, because while I was still a professor at UVA, a man named Austin Chase called me one day. Chase was writing a book called Harvard and the Unabomber, and he called me because he had figured out that my father, who was a well-known psychiatrist, was a close friend of the professor who did these experiments, and that professor was Henry Murray. I knew Henry as a child. Henry only published one paper that came out of this in the early 60s, didn't identify the nature of the subjects that he used, but I guess everybody assumed they were undergraduates in those days, as they often still are. So this, again, is an indication of how close the academy was to these experiments in those days. That is different now. In fact, what this national intelligence community really wants to do is to improve its relationship with the academy. And that's another story that I'll just try to tell you in a minute. Kurt Lewin, just to give you an idea again of how many people were involved in this, founder of modern social psychology, also an OSS psychological warfare consultant. And one historian has estimated that perhaps a third of the major research university faculty in these fields, social science, behavior, were somehow involved with the national security system at that time. Even is nothing sacred. My favorite parapsychologist after William James, J.B. Rhine, the Duke University professor, who after he died, it was revealed, was himself a consultant on psychological operations. These were the days when the agency was trying to figure out if it was possible to bend spoons from a distance. You remember that? The Uri Geller stuff. Also the notion that, that some people had the ability to engage in remote viewing. So you point to a place on the map and some people seem to have the ability to see that place even though they've never been there. This would have tremendous possibilities if you wanted to know what an al-Qaeda training camp looks like. You just point to a spot in the Pakistani mountains and there they are. But nobody knows. I've talked to people who were reporting on this in those days, in the late 60s, early 70s. Nobody knows if the agency actually believed this was possible. But they were certainly getting the Soviet Union to spend money on it, which might have been the whole purpose. So that's a little bit of the history. Now, bringing it up to the present day, since I'm saying so many nice things about other institutions, here's a remark about Penn State. So it turns out that at Penn State, there is an entity called the Marine Corps Research University. I actually gave this talk at Penn State 3 months ago, and I asked people in the audience about this size if anybody at Penn State knew about the Marine Corps Research University. I think one guy sort of raised his hand. So they are essentially an opportunity, a venue for Penn State to receive research funds from the Marine Corps. And this is I love the web. So this is the first page of a 2-page contract that was let by the Marine Corps Research University to Penn State on September 18th, 2001. And I want you to pay attention to the title, which puzzled me when I first saw it, and I've been working on this stuff for a while. The title of this project was a technical assessment of the 81 millimeter non-lethal mortar munition. Non-lethal mortar. So I called my friend at Fort Detrick, who's been working on biological and chemical weapons issues for 30 years, was a University of Pennsylvania faculty member actually for a while in biology. And I said, Art, what would a non-lethal mortar be? I mean, I watched all the World War II movies. I thought that, mortars are supposed to kill you. He thought for a second. He said, well, I think it would be something that would put you to sleep. So hold that thought. This is the bottom half of the second page of this contract. I would love to get a contract that was just 2 pages from anybody right now. We're all going for these challenge grants at Penn. So this would be really nice to be able to have a really simple project like this. I just want you to note that the second page says that part of the obligation of Penn State in fulfilling this contract was going to be to have what they call in military speak SMEs, subject matter experts, who will be familiar with the human effects of testing of the non-lethal mortar. They didn't say they're going to do human testing, which would have been a whole other complicated thing. They would have had to go through a special committee and so forth. But there were people who were familiar with what it would be like to take the next step. So what are they talking about? So this is an image of a non-lethal mortar round. Now, notice that it's a simulated non-lethal mortar round because if you had actually done a test with the actual stuff, which I haven't told you what it is yet, on the non-lethal mortar, that would probably be a violation of the Chemical Weapons Treaty. So you have to use a simulant. So this is what it looks like. You can see it's something that's probably a gas. It's something being aerosolized coming out of this thing. So I don't know how many of you remember this event that took place in the Dubrovka Theater in Moscow in 2002. This is when Chechen terrorists took over a theater during a musical performance. 700 people were being held hostage. The Russian army decided to solve this problem in a typically genteel fashion by pumping something into the air conditioning system. And what they pumped in was an opioid called fentanyl, or maybe a version of it called carfentanil. Unfortunately, they didn't tell the emergency medical personnel waiting outside with dozens of ambulances what they were using, because there's a standard antidote to fentanyl exposure, and they didn't tell them what it was, so most of the children who were being held hostage in the theater died, at least 128. Not the best day for the National, I am a member of the National Academies, not the best day for the National Academies. The same day that happened, they recommended the creation of centers of excellence on the use of non-lethal mortars in crowd control. So that was probably not very good not very good timing. That's one example of the kinds of things that, that people are interested in these days, in the idea of managing behavior. But now I want to move to something a little different. I just want to dazzle you, because there are no neuroscientists here, with some of the amazing stuff that's coming out of the neurosciences, and now moving more to a different level of this discussion. So we all see these amazing images that are coming out of functional MRI labs, where you can look in and see where the oxygenation is going. So this is a very simple experiment that was published a couple of years ago. This is the difference between actually thinking about doing a math problem and doing a math problem in your head, as it were. So the green area is an algorithmic average of a number of different brains. People have been told, when they're in the big magnet, to think about doing a math problem, and then they actually ask you to do the math problem in your head, and so that's the execution area, the red area. We're actually being able to do in a certain way what people who believed that lumps on the head, in the late 19th century could tell you about somebody's brain. We're kind of doing that now, only it's kind of lumps in the brain on the inside, or systems in the brain, as it were. Here's an even more remarkable experiment, and I'm going to make the tie-in to the national intelligence stuff in a minute. In this experiment, a number of subjects were shown about 1,750 pictures, and while they were looking at those pictures, the neuroscientists were taking different readings of their brain, sort of baseline readings. They then showed them 120 new pictures, and without knowing what pictures they were looking at, the neuroscientists, using those baseline images that they'd gotten from the other pictures, were able to guess up to 92% accuracy what pictures they were looking at, just by looking at their brains. Now, the interesting question is this mind reading? Are we getting to the point where we can actually tell what you're thinking about without knowing what you're looking at, or what you might be experiencing? So there are different ways of doing this. I've talked about functional MRI. There are PET scans. There's near-infrared spectroscopy. The Howard Hughes Medical Institute now is spending 10 years developing ways of getting into the molecules in our brain in a much more granulated way. This stuff is moving along very rapidly. That's looking inside the brain. What about doing stuff to the brain from outside? Well, I'm doing stuff to your brains right now from outside. But what if we could put a magnet on the surface of your skull and change your perceptions and attitudes, as long as that magnet is active? That's one technique for that is called transcranial magnetic stimulation. This is stuff that's going on in the laboratory already. Now, what if you could combine those things and actually look inside somebody's brain wirelessly, remotely, while you're also controlling their attitudes and perceptions and changing their perceptions? So DARPA is very interested in this. A lot of people in this room know about DARPA. I am not a DARPA basher. Although they wouldn't talk to me while I was writing my book, I'm a DARPA booster. They have a relatively small budget. They're not a spy agency. They're a science agency. They've done things like the stealth bomber. They created the internet. It was called the ARPANET in the 60s. And they're dedicated to long-range innovation and pushing things forward as quickly as they can. So here's one example, the head web, which would not only perhaps wirelessly be able to read your brain at a distance, maybe you're thousands of miles away, it might also be able to modify your brain while you're out there. Maybe you're a Navy SEAL trying to fire a single shot somewhere near the Horn of Africa. So, down-regulating your levels of stress might be a very important thing if you're somebody who's in a stressful situation like that. And reading what's going on in your brain while you're having that experience. There are lots and lots of applications of this. Of course, if you're a neurologist, you would love to know what your patient is experiencing digitally between visits. If you have a patient who has Parkinson's disease, for example, this has fantastic dual-use possibilities for medicine as well as in the military. Are we going toward mind reading or brainwashing? So philosophically, the caption is, I don't hear anything, Joey, are you sure you're thinking? When the metaphysicians in the room may disagree with me, I don't know that as a philosopher I have the language anymore to describe what's going on. I took a seminar in graduate school on free will and determinism. I don't think any of that old philosophy applies to what's happening now. I think we're catching up with what the scientists are doing. Briefly, I'm going to point out that we also have work going on how other species experiment, honeybees, how dogs smell that could be useful to us. There are programs called Enhanced Human Performance, Continued Assistance Performance. DARPA is interested in the possibility of augmenting cognition. You can read about all this stuff on the web. Some of it is pretty straightforward, like cockpit design, but others gets into neuropharmacology and robotics. Here is something that is supposed to come out from DARPA in the next few months. These are Luke's binoculars. These are binoculars that are not only going to show you what you're looking at, but they're also going to tell you where in the visual field you ought to be attending that you're not looking. This is going to be a feedback mechanism that is going to make Luke Skywalker's binoculars look prehistoric. Here's an example of some interesting brain-machine interaction activity that's going on, experiments that are going on. Here the idea is something, this is the experiments that are actually creating the next wave of video games that your children or grandchildren are going to be using in a few years. And some of them are already out there for an experimental basis. Moving the cursor on a computer only by thinking about it. So, you know, my kids are now 19 and 22. They were really, my son especially, got really good, that's a Y chromosome thing, about, you know, using his thumbs much faster than I could. Pretty soon it's just going to be, within 5 years, just the brain. At what point are we talking about cyborg technology? Well, we already are. We are partially brains and partially machines already. Here's an experiment that was done with a rat at my former medical school. I was at downstate in Brooklyn for a few years, which I thought was really kind of bringing rats to Brooklyn, and there was some paradox there. So this is a little robot rat, basically, a real rat that's being trained through the right kind of pulses from a computer to turn and move in various directions. This was done by the great Mexican psychologist Jose Delgado in 1958 with a bull. That's Dr. Delgado on the bull ring. He got the bull to stop in his tracks by pushing a button. Here's what all of my students, I'm afraid, are very interested in right now, Provigil. This is called the anti-sleep pill. This is already being used instead of speed in the Air Force, according to reports. Stuff can keep you awake and alert for 60 to 80 hours. The anti-conscience pill. So this pill, the possibility here is, can beta blockers be used, not only for people with heart disease, but also to block the consolidation of guilt and negative feelings with memory? Could you use this with people with PTSD? Could you actually use this prophylactically before you send somebody into combat so they don't develop PTSD? But maybe they'll actually come home guilt-free. And do we want a generation of guilt-free soldiers? Here's the last one that I'm going to show you. It takes me back to the interrogation issue. What if instead of waterboarding, you could give somebody a drug that would make them trust you? I know my students think this has great dating possibilities, but I've discouraged it. There are about half a dozen studies that suggest that you could give somebody oxytocin, a naturally occurring hormone in the brain, that that is associated with socializing with people. What if you gave them oxytocin instead of putting them on a waterboard? Would that be acceptable under the rules that are going to be emerging from the period we're now in with this conversation about the CIA interrogation strategies? So I'm going to leave you with that, and I'm sure there's a lot more to talk about, but I want to leave you with positive, trusting feelings toward me, and not taking us into the break, which you deserve. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor. That was most illuminating. Who are either by reputation, Dr. Bryce, I'm Annenberg 62, Paul Starzinski, and I was with the Foreign Service for a long time. Who are the people that are, how do you say, most philosophically or morally critical of all of this, and what are their primary arguments? Thank you.
Wow. I think there's a variety of folks who are concerned about this. So some are scientists who are worried that their work, particularly neuroscientists, are going to be drawn into this kind of the dark side, and they're very concerned about those associations. So I mentioned in passing that DARPA won't talk to me, not officially anyway. Many neuroscientists who are working on CIA or DARPA contracts also won't talk to me, not for the record. They'll talk to me off the record, because they don't want their work drawn into the paranoid fantasies that many people have about what this could lead to. Now, having said that, I'm going to go to the other extreme, which is the people with the paranoid fantasies, who call me just about every week or send me an email because they're sure that their brains are being controlled by the CIA. And I'm going to tell you, there are many, many such people. Some of them have borderline personality disorders, but many of them are very functional in the rest of their lives. I think the concern comes from people with legitimate concerns about where neuroscience is taking us in terms of modifying the brain, and others are people who have some psychological problems and will sort of glom onto anything that confirms their delusional structure. But the fact that you have very serious people and people who are serious but delusional in the same conversation makes it complicated, makes it very difficult. Now, you also have, and I want to leave you with this on that question, you also have people who are in the intelligence community who feel that we do need to be on the cutting edge of these issues. We can't turn our backs on them, that we need to be able to incorporate these technologies, because if we don't, other folks will. And I've been on a couple of committees for the National Research Council, one going on right now, on the question of how to reintegrate the academic world into the intelligence community, which has been lost in the last 30 years for various social and political reasons.
What is DARPA?
Oh, sorry. So, you're in Washington and you're rushing, and yeah. So DARPA stands for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. DARPA was founded in the late 50s, and the goal of DARPA is a very small budget. $3 billion, especially now, is, right, let's face it, in $1 trillion bailout doesn't mean anything. So the DARPA's mission is to take today's technology and move it 30 years into the future. They go for blue sky science. Most of what they do is public. It is not secret. They employ university scientists, including people at Penn, to do their work. So the ARPANET was the predecessor to the internet and finally the web. They did the stealth bomber. That was secret. They also made the computer mouse. They've done some things that weren't so successful. For example, standard government toilet odor, which was developed during the Vietnam War in an attempt to drive the Viet Cong out of their tunnels. Turned out that it made our guys sicker than it made the Viet Cong, because the Viet Cong grew up on farms. But there is something you'll be happy to know called standard government toilet odor. So there's a lot of stuff that DARPA does. Again, I'm a DARPA booster, not a DARPA basher, but there are a lot of people who wouldn't agree with me, but they are a science agency. Sir.
Hi, I'm Kent Myers, PhD from Penn. What about an old-fashioned technique of talking? A lot of your tax dollars are being spent on information operations, and there's a sense in which propaganda can be performed in a completely different way.
Yes.
Mass hypnotism,
right.
Making publics think differently.
Yeah.
It seems like that's a big growth area, and that has something
Propaganda.
To do with brain research and how you can affect people. Is that maybe where a lot of the action is going to be?
I think that's where people like Secretary Gates think it ought to go. In other words, I think that sometimes there is some concern among some people in the security establishment that we're so dazzled by this technology and the drugs and brain-machine interface and so forth that you can go back to basics. So one concern that Secretary Gates has is to bring the anthropologists back in. So simple hand gestures like this don't mean the same thing in Baghdad that they mean to you and me. So, and then deaths have almost certainly resulted from that failure of understanding in the early years of the occupation in Iraq. So the answer is, I think there are people who are aware that talking, both in terms of interrogation and in terms of what we used to call propaganda, is an art form that we shouldn't leave behind, and it has been somewhat neglected probably in the last few years.
Please join me in thanking Professor Jonathan Moreno,